It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world felt like it had slowed down just enough to let people breathe. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. On Maple Street, the air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of cars passing by. Marcus Johnson walked home, his steps steady and unhurried. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and an easy confidence that came from years of hard work and determination. His suit, neatly pressed and dark blue, made him look every bit the professional he was. Marcus had just finished a long day at his law firm, where he worked as an attorney. He was preparing for a big promotion, spending hours reviewing case files and strategizing with colleagues. As he strolled along the sidewalk, his mind wandered to thoughts of his upcoming weekend plans, a quiet dinner with friends and maybe some time to relax. It was supposed to be a normal evening, unremarkable in every way, but sometimes normal evenings can take unexpected turns. A police cruiser turned onto Maple Street, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Inside were two officers, Greg Peterson and Chris Miller. They had been patrolling the area when they noticed Marcus walking alone. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He looked like any other person heading home after a long day. But Greg and Chris saw things differently. Their eyes narrowed as they watched him, their minds racing with assumptions that weren't based on facts but rather on biases they didn't even realize they carried. Greg leaned over to Chris and muttered something under his breath. "What's he doing out here so late? Doesn't look right." Chris nodded in agreement, though neither of them could point to anything specific that seemed suspicious. Still, they decided to pull over. The cruiser slowed to a stop near Marcus, its tires crunching against the pavement. Both officers stepped out, their boots heavy and deliberate. Marcus heard the sound of the car door opening and turned to see the officers approaching him. He stopped walking and stood still, waiting to see what they wanted. His face remained calm, but inside he felt a flicker of unease. He'd lived in this neighborhood for years and knew most of his neighbors. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home. But experience had taught him that being black often meant people assumed otherwise. "Excuse me, sir," Greg said, his voice sharp and demanding. "Can I see your ID?" Marcus blinked, taken aback by the request. There was no reason for them to ask for identification. He hadn't broken any laws, and he certainly hadn't given them cause to stop him. Still, he kept his tone polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. "I'm just heading home." Chris stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "We'll decide if there's a problem," he snapped. "Now show us your ID." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, making sure to keep his movements slow and deliberate. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate if someone misinterpreted his actions. "I live around here," he explained calmly. "I've been working late tonight." Greg glanced at the license, then back at Marcus. A sneer crossed his face as he held up the card. "This says you're a lawyer. You expect us to believe that?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Why wouldn't they believe it? His license clearly stated his occupation, and he carried himself with the poise of someone who had earned respect through years of effort. Yet instead of acknowledging the truth, Greg and Chris exchanged skeptical looks. "That suit probably costs more than your monthly paycheck," Chris remarked, his tone mocking. "You steal it or what?" Marcus clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. He hated moments like these when people judged him not by his character, but by the color of his skin. He reminded himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't help. It would only give them more ammunition to use against him. "I bought it myself," he replied evenly. "If you don't have a valid reason for stopping me, I'd like to go home now." But Greg and Chris weren't interested in letting him leave. Instead, they began peppering him with questions, none of which had anything to do with actual criminal activity. Where was he coming from? Who did he work for? Did he know anyone else on the street? Each answer Marcus gave seemed to irritate them further, as if they were determined to find fault with whatever he said. Finally, Greg grabbed Marcus's arm and twisted it behind his back. "You're coming with us," he growled. Before Marcus could protest, cold metal clicked around. His wrists, handcuffs. He felt a surge of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't happening because he'd done something wrong. It was happening because of who he was. As they shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, Marcus stared out the window, watching as curious neighbors peeked through their curtains. Some looked sympathetic while others quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. He wanted to shout at them to tell them to speak up, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. For now, all he could do was endure. The ride to the station was tense and silent. Marcus sat upright, refusing to let the situation break him. He thought about his family, his career, and the future he had worked so hard to build. He couldn't let this moment define him, not when he knew he was innocent. As the cruiser pulled into the station parking lot, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't going to end here. If Greg and Chris thought they could silence him, they were wrong. One day they would regret ever crossing his path. The police station was a cold, sterile place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cracked tiles of the floor. Marcus sat in a small, windowless room, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The chair he was forced to sit on was hard and uncomfortable, but Marcus didn't complain. He kept his focus sharp, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what would happen next. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something systemic. Still, that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Greg and Chris stood outside the room talking in hushed tones. They had already decided what they wanted to do with Marcus. To them, he wasn't a person anymore. He was a problem to be dealt with. "We'll charge him with resisting arrest," Greg said, tapping his pen against his notepad. "That should shut him up." Chris nodded, his lips curling into a smirk. "And maybe disorderly conduct, too. Let's see how cocky he is when he's stuck in here all night." Neither of them cared whether the charges were true. All that mattered was making sure Marcus couldn't fight back. They figured if they threw enough accusations at him, no one would question their version of events. After all, who would believe a lawyer in handcuffs over two officers in uniform? After what felt like hours, the door finally opened, and another officer walked in. This one was younger, quieter, and seemed less aggressive than Greg and Chris. He carried a clipboard and motioned for Marcus to stand. "Come with me," he said simply. Marcus rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. The cuffs dug into his wrists, but he ignored the discomfort. As he followed the officer down a narrow hallway, he noticed the stares from other cops. Some looked curious, others hostile. It was clear they'd already made up their minds about him, but Marcus refused to let their judgment weigh him down. He reminded himself that he was innocent, and eventually, the truth would come out. They led him into an interrogation room. Unlike the holding cell, this room had a table and two chairs. A camera mounted on the wall recorded everything. Marcus was told to sit, and the cuffs were removed. Finally, his arms ached from being restrained for so long, but he stretched them carefully, trying not to show weakness. Greg and Chris entered moments later, closing the door behind them. They took their seats across from Marcus, their expressions smug. "All right, Mr. Johnson," Greg began, leaning forward. "Let's talk about why you were acting so suspicious earlier." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I was walking home, that's all." Chris snorted. "Walking home doesn't explain the fancy suit or the attitude." Marcus sighed inwardly. He could feel the trap they were setting. If he argued too much, they'd twist his words. If he stayed silent, they'd call it uncooperative. Still, he chose his response carefully. "I've already told you I'm a lawyer. My job requires me to dress professionally. And as for my attitude, I don't think asking questions makes me guilty of anything." Greg slammed his hand on the table, startling Marcus slightly. "Don't play games with us," he snapped. "We know your type, always thinking you're better than everyone else." Marcus clenched his fists under the table but kept his voice calm. "I'm not playing games. I'm just trying to understand why I'm here. You stopped me without cause, and now you're accusing me of crimes I..." Didn't commit. That's not justice. For a moment, neither Greg nor Chris said anything. They exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by Marcus's composure. Most people in his position would have been scared or angry, but Marcus remained steady. It unnerved them, though they wouldn't admit it. Finally, Chris leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Fine. If you want to act innocent, we'll give you the chance to prove it. Tell us where you were tonight before we pulled you over. Marcus thought for a second before answering. I was at my office. I work at Carter & Associates, a law firm downtown. You can check with my boss if you don't believe me. Greg scribbled something on his notepad, though Marcus doubted it had anything to do with verifying his alibi. Yeah, we'll look into it, he muttered dismissively. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, but even if you were at work, that doesn't mean you weren't up to something. Marcus bit back a retort. He knew arguing further would only waste time. Instead, he focused on staying patient. At some point, they'd have to let him go, or at least allow him to call a lawyer. Until then, he needed to bide his time. Hours passed. Greg and Chris continued grilling Marcus, asking repetitive questions and throwing baseless accusations his way. They claimed they had reports of someone matching his description loitering near a convenience store earlier that evening. They hinted at stolen property and connections to criminal activity. None of it made sense, but that didn't matter to them. What mattered was keeping control of the narrative. Eventually, exhaustion began to creep in. Marcus hadn't eaten since lunch, and the lack of sleep was starting to take its toll. Still, he refused to break. Every time they pushed, he pushed back, not with anger but with logic and reason. By the time they finally left the room, Marcus felt drained but resolute. He knew he couldn't win this battle alone, but he also knew help was coming. Outside the station, word of Marcus's arrest spread quickly. One of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, had seen the entire scene unfold. She recognized Marcus immediately and found it hard to believe he could be involved in anything illegal. Determined to help, she called Linda Harper, Marcus's longtime mentor and friend. Linda was a seasoned attorney known for her sharp mind and relentless pursuit of justice. When Mrs. Harper explained what had happened, Linda didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed straight to the station. Along the way, she called several colleagues, rallying support for Marcus's case. By the time she arrived, she was ready to fight. Inside the station, Linda demanded to see Marcus. The officers tried to stall her, claiming visiting hours were over, but Linda wasn't someone who backed down easily. You're violating his rights, she said firmly. Either let me see him now, or I'll file a complaint so fast it'll make your head spin. Reluctantly, the officers complied. When Linda entered the interrogation room, Marcus looked up, relief washing over his face. Linda, he said softly. Thank God you're here. Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Don't worry, Marcus. We'll get you out of this. She turned to the officers lingering by the door. I want these charges dropped immediately. If you don't, I'll ensure every media outlet in the city knows exactly how this department treats innocent citizens. Greg and Chris bristled at her words, but they knew better than to argue with someone like Linda. For now, they stepped aside, allowing her to speak privately with Marcus. Over the next hour, Linda listened intently as Marcus recounted everything that had happened. She took detailed notes, her expression growing darker with each new revelation. When he finished, she gave him a small, encouraging smile. You did the right thing by staying calm, she said. Now leave the rest to me. Bye. The time they left the station, it was nearly midnight. Marcus was free for now, but the battle was far from over. Linda promised to file a formal complaint against Greg and Chris, as well as prepare to fight the false charges in court. As they parted ways, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Linda by his side, he believed justice was possible. Little did he, or Greg and Chris, realize just how much this incident would change their lives forever. The days following Marcus's release from the police station were a blur of activity. Linda Harper wasted no time in getting to work. She filed a formal complaint with the police department, outlining every detail of the incident, from the unlawful stop to the fabricated charges. She also reached out to reporters, knowing that public attention could put pressure on the authorities to take the matter seriously. Marcus, meanwhile, tried to return to his normal routine. He went back to work at Carter and Associates, reviewing case files and preparing for meetings as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't easy. The memory of being handcuffed, questioned, and accused of crimes he didn't commit lingered in his mind. Every time he passed a police cruiser on the street or saw officers in uniform, his stomach tightened with anger and frustration. Still, he reminded himself to stay focused. He had a job to do, and letting his emotions get the best of him wouldn't help anyone. At home, Marcus spent hours talking to Linda about the case. They strategized late into the night, discussing how to expose the truth and hold Greg and Chris accountable. Linda was determined to make sure this incident didn't just fade away. It needed to spark real change. "This isn't just about you, Marcus," she often said. "It's about everyone who's been treated unfairly because of their race." While Marcus and Linda worked tirelessly, Greg and Chris carried on as if nothing had changed. To them, the arrest was just another day on the job. They laughed about it during lunch breaks, joking about how cocky Marcus had been. "He'll learn his lesson once we slap those charges on him," Greg said one afternoon, leaning back in his chair. "No way he gets off clean." Chris nodded in agreement, though deep down he felt a flicker of unease. He'd seen cases like this before, officers accused of misconduct only to face public backlash. Still, he pushed the thought aside. "Even if people start asking questions," he said confidently, "they'll believe us over him. We're the ones wearing the badge." Despite their bravado, cracks began to show, too. The police department launched an internal investigation after receiving Linda's complaint. At first, Greg and Chris dismissed it as a formality. They were sure their higher-ups would protect them. But as days turned into weeks, they started to feel uneasy. Colleagues avoided eye contact with them in the hallways, and whispers followed them wherever they went. It was clear that not everyone believed their version of events. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to excel in his career. His colleagues noticed how composed he remained, despite the challenges he faced outside of work. Some offered words of encouragement, while others kept their distance, unsure of what to say. One person who stood firmly by Marcus's side was Emily Dawson, a young paralegal at the firm. Emily admired Marcus's resilience and dedication to justice. She often stayed late to help him organize documents and research legal precedents related to racial profiling. One evening, as Marcus and Emily pored over case files in his office, Emily hesitated before speaking up. "Do you ever think about giving up?" she asked softly. "I mean, fighting the system. It feels so overwhelming sometimes." Marcus looked up from the papers in front of him. He smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "Every day," he admitted. "But then, I remind myself why I started doing this in the first place. If I give up, it means they win, and I can't let that happen. Not for me and not for anyone else who's been treated the way I was." Emily nodded, her respect for Marcus growing even stronger. She knew he was right, but it didn't make the fight any less daunting. As weeks passed, news of Marcus's ordeal spread beyond his immediate circle. Community leaders and activists began reaching out, offering support and resources. A local civil rights organization even invited Marcus to speak at a rally. At first he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, especially when it came to sharing such a personal story. But Linda encouraged him to take the opportunity. "Your voice matters," she told him. "People need to hear what you've been through." Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. On the day of the rally, he stood on a small stage in front of a crowd of hundreds. Microphones amplified his voice as he recounted the events of that fateful evening. The stop, the accusations, the humiliation. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he finished, the crowd erupted, in applause. Strangers approached him afterward, thanking him for sharing his experience and vowing to stand with him in the fight for justice. The rally marked a turning point for Marcus. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of hope. The support he received reinforced his belief that change was possible, even if it took time and effort. He returned to work the next day with renewed determination, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. Around the same time, an unexpected opportunity arose. A vacancy opened up for a district judge position in the courthouse, where Marcus's trial against Greg and Chris would soon take place. The role required someone with integrity, experience, and a commitment to fairness, qualities Marcus embodied. Several prominent figures in the legal community recommended him for the position, citing his impeccable track record and dedication to justice. When Marcus received the call informing him of his appointment, he was stunned. Becoming a judge had never been part of his plan, but the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Here was a chance to step into a position of power and influence, ensuring that cases like his were handled fairly. After some deliberation, and a lot of encouragement from Linda, he accepted the offer. News of Marcus's promotion spread quickly. Most people celebrated the decision, praising him as a beacon of hope in a flawed system. However, not everyone shared the sentiment. Greg and Chris, upon hearing the news, were horrified. Panic set in as they realized they'd have to face Marcus in court, not as a victim, but as the judge presiding over their case. "This can't be happening," Greg muttered one evening, pacing back and forth in his living room. "There's no way they're letting him judge us. He hates us." Chris sat on the couch, his face pale. "We'll request another judge," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They can't force us to go through with this." But their attempts to remove Marcus from the case fell flat. Legal experts reviewed their request and found no valid grounds for recusal. Marcus had earned the position through merit, and there was no evidence to suggest he couldn't remain impartial. Frustrated and fearful, Greg and Chris braced themselves for what was to come. As the trial date approached, tension hung thick in the air. Greg and Chris struggled to sleep at night, haunted by memories of the stop and the lies they'd told to justify it. They began second-guessing every decision they'd made that evening, realizing too late the consequences of their actions. For Marcus, however, the upcoming trial represented more than just a chance for personal vindication. It was an opportunity to shine a light on the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement and the justice system. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it head-on. Little did Greg and Chris know their lives were about to change forever, and not in the way they expected. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. People filled the benches, eager to witness what promised to be a landmark case. Reporters lined the back of the room, notebooks in hand, ready to capture every detail. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity and unease. For Greg Peterson and Chris Miller, sitting at the defendant's table felt surreal. They glanced around nervously, their eyes darting from the crowd to the empty judge's seat. Every time someone entered the room, they stiffened, wondering if it was Marcus Johnson. When Marcus finally walked in, the room fell silent. He moved, with quiet confidence, his black robes flowing behind him as he took his place on the bench. His expression was calm but unreadable, giving no hint of what he might be thinking or feeling. Greg and Chris avoided looking directly at him, their guilt weighing heavily on their shoulders. To them, Marcus wasn't just a judge. He was the man they had wronged, the person they had treated as less than human. And now, he held their fates in his hands. The courtroom clerk called the proceedings to order, and everyone rose as Marcus took his seat. "Please be seated," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. It was clear that he intended to conduct himself with professionalism, leaving no room for doubt about his impartiality. Still, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Greg and Chris shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unable to shake the feeling that this was some kind of cosmic punishment for their actions. The prosecution began by presenting its case. Attorney Linda Harper stood before the court, her presence commanding attention. She outlined the events of the night Marcus was detained, using witnesses and evidence to paint a vivid picture of racial profiling and abuse of power. Neighbors who had seen the arrest testified about how unnecessary and aggressive it had seemed. One woman described how she had watched through her window as Greg and Chris handcuffed Marcus without cause. Her voice trembled with emotion as she recounted the fear she had felt, not for her own safety but for Marcus's. Linda also introduced surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store. The grainy video showed Marcus walking calmly down the street, minding his own business until the police cruiser pulled up beside him. There was nothing suspicious about his behavior, nothing that warranted an arrest. Yet Greg and Chris could be seen approaching him aggressively, their body language confrontational even before they spoke to him. The footage was damning, and Linda made sure to emphasize its significance. "This isn't just about one bad decision," she told the jury, her tone firm but measured. "It's about a pattern of behavior that has no place in law enforcement. Officers are supposed to protect and serve, not harass and intimidate based on prejudice." Greg and Chris listened intently, their faces pale. Their defense attorney tried to counter Linda's arguments, claiming that his clients had acted within protocol and made split-second decisions under pressure. But his words lacked conviction, and the inconsistencies in Greg and Chris's testimonies became glaringly obvious during cross-examination. Marcus played a critical role in exposing those inconsistencies. As the presiding judge, he asked pointed questions during witness testimonies, cutting through vague answers and forcing both sides to address the truth. When Greg and Chris took the stand, Marcus's questions were sharp and deliberate. "You claim you stopped Mr. Johnson because he appeared suspicious," he said to Greg, leaning slightly forward. "Can you explain exactly what made him seem suspicious? Was it his clothing, his mannerisms, or was it simply the color of his skin?" Greg stammered, caught off guard by the directness of the question. We thought he might have been involved in something," he replied weakly. "He was walking alone late at night." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression neutral. "So walking alone late at night is grounds for suspicion?" he asked. "Does that apply to everyone, or only certain individuals?" Greg looked down, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Chris fared no better when it was his turn to testify. Under Marcus's scrutiny, their story unraveled piece by piece. The jury watched closely, taking notes as each contradiction came to light. By the end of the day, it was clear that Greg and Chris's defense was crumbling. As the trial progressed, Marcus maintained his composure, never letting his emotions show. Inside, however, he felt a storm of conflicting feelings. Anger, sadness, and frustration swirled within him, reminders of the injustice he had endured. But there was also a sense of purpose, a determination to ensure that cases like his didn't go unnoticed or unpunished. He reminded himself that this wasn't personal, it was about accountability. If Greg and Chris walked away without consequences, it would send a message that such behavior was acceptable. That was something Marcus couldn't allow. Outside the courtroom, public interest in the case continued to grow. News outlets covered every development, sparking conversations about racial bias in policing. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end police brutality." Some supporters approached Marcus after sessions ended, thanking him for standing up against systemic racism. Others sent letters and messages of encouragement, urging him to keep fighting for change. Despite the support, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. The trial still had days to go and anything could happen. Greg and Chris's defense team was working hard to sway the jury, planting seeds of doubt wherever possible. They argued that their clients had been following orders, that they were products of a flawed system rather than individual villains. While some jurors seemed sympathetic to this argument, others remained skeptical, their expressions stern as they listened to the evidence. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Marcus met with Linda in his chambers. Exhaustion lined both their faces, but their resolve hadn't wavered. "They're trying to shift the blame," Linda said, shaking her head, "claiming the system forced them to act the way they did." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That doesn't excuse their actions," he said firmly. "People always have a choice. They chose hate and prejudice over fairness and respect. That's what we need to prove." Linda nodded in agreement. "We will," she assured him. "The truth is on our side." We just need to make sure the jury sees it." By the final day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Closing arguments were set to begin, and everyone braced themselves for what was to come. The prosecution went first, with Linda delivering a powerful speech that resonated deeply with the jury. "This case isn't just about two officers who made mistakes," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about the kind of society we want to live in. Do we want a world where people are judged by the content of their character? Or do we want a world where fear and prejudice dictate our actions? The choice is yours." When it was the defense's turn, their attorney struggled to find solid ground. His argument sounded hollow compared to Linda's passionate plea for justice. He appealed to the jury's empathy, asking them to consider the pressures faced by police officers. But his words lacked authenticity, and many in the room sensed. Finally, it was Marcus's turn to address the court. Rising from his seat, he looked out at the jury, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, "your task is not easy. You must weigh the evidence carefully and decide whether the defendants acted within the bounds of the law. Remember, the law exists to protect everyone equally, regardless of race, gender, or background. Justice demands accountability, and accountability requires courage." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Do not let fear or bias cloud your judgment. Look at the facts, listen to your conscience, and deliver a verdict that reflects the values we hold dear as a society." With that, Marcus concluded his instructions and dismissed the jury to deliberate. As they filed out of the room, the weight of their responsibility hung heavy in the air. Greg and Chris sat silently, their faces pale with apprehension. For the first time, they truly understood the gravity of what they had done and the potential consequences they now faced. The wait for the verdict felt endless. Marcus returned to his chambers where he sat alone, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about the long nights spent preparing for the trial, the sacrifices he had made, and the countless others who had suffered similar injustices. This wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. Whatever the outcome, he vowed to keep fighting for a better, fairer future. Little did Greg and Chris know, their reckoning was closer than they imagined. The jury deliberations stretched on for hours, each minute feeling like an eternity. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Greg Peterson and Chris Miller sat stiffly at the defendant's table, their faces pale and drawn. They exchanged nervous glances but said nothing, both too overwhelmed by fear to speak. The defense attorney paced back and forth near the bench, occasionally checking his watch or whispering something to his clients. Outside the room, reporters waited anxiously for news while protesters continued their vigil, holding signs that demanded justice. Marcus Johnson remained in his chambers during the wait. He tried to focus on paperwork, signing documents and reviewing case files, but his mind kept drifting back to the trial. He thought about the testimonies he had heard, the evidence presented, and the raw emotions that had filled the courtroom. Though he had maintained a calm exterior throughout the proceedings, inside, he felt a storm of conflicting feelings. Anger, sadness, and frustration churned within him, but so did hope. This wasn't just about punishing two officers. It was about setting an example, showing that accountability mattered. Finally, late in the afternoon, the jury returned. The bailiff announced their presence, and everyone rose as Marcus re-entered the courtroom. His expression remained neutral as he took his seat, though his heart pounded with anticipation. The foreman of the jury stood up, holding a slip of paper in his hand. All eyes were on him as he cleared his throat and read the verdict aloud. "We find the defendants, Gregory Peterson and Christopher Miller, guilty on all counts." A wave of gasps rippled through the room. Some people clapped quietly while others sat in stunned silence. Greg and Chris stared at the floor, their faces blank with shock. For a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. Then, reality sank in. Bailiffs moved forward to handcuff the two men who offered no resistance. As they were led away, Greg turned to look at Marcus one last time, his eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus met his gaze briefly, his expression unreadable. When the courtroom began to empty, Marcus stayed seated for a few moments longer. He let the weight of the verdict settle over him, reflecting on what it meant, not just for him but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. There was still so much work to do. Later that evening, Marcus met with Linda Harper at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. They sat in a corner booth, sipping coffee as they discussed the day's events. "It's done," Linda said, her voice tinged with relief. "They got what they deserved." Marcus nodded slowly, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Yeah, but this is bigger than them. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." Linda smiled faintly, recognizing the determination in his voice. "You've already started making waves, Marcus. People are talking about this case everywhere. It's sparking conversations we need to have." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the crowd outside the courthouse earlier that day. Protesters had cheered when the verdict was announced, their chants echoing through the streets. Strangers had approached him afterward, thanking him for standing up against injustice. It was overwhelming, but also inspiring. He realized that his fight wasn't just personal anymore, it was part of something larger. As the days passed, life began to change for everyone involved. For Greg and Chris, prison was a harsh reality they hadn't anticipated. Stripped of their badges and privileges, they found themselves surrounded by inmates who viewed them with disdain. Being on the wrong side of the bars gave them plenty of time to reflect on their actions. Nights were the hardest. Alone in their cells, they replayed the trial in their minds, the damning evidence, the angry witnesses, the cold finality of Marcus's instructions to the jury. Sometimes they argued with each other, blaming the system or bad luck for their downfall. Other times they sat in silence, unable to deny the truth any longer. Greg often lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the night he had stopped Marcus, remembering how quickly things had spiraled out of control. At the time, he had convinced himself that he was doing his job, protecting the community from potential threats. Now, he couldn't ignore the fact that his decisions had been driven by prejudice, not facts. The realization gnawed at him, leaving him hollow and ashamed. Chris, meanwhile, struggled with guilt. He remembered the mocking tone he had used when questioning Marcus about his suit, the way he had dismissed his explanations without listening. These memories haunted him, reminding him of the harm he had caused. He wrote letters to his family, apologizing for the shame he had brought upon them. But he knew words weren't enough to undo the damage. Outside of prison, Marcus continued his work as a judge, balancing his responsibilities with advocacy efforts. He became a prominent figure in discussions about police reform, using his platform to push for transparency and accountability. Community leaders invited him to speak at events, and activists sought his advice on legal strategies. Despite the demands on his time, Marcus made sure to stay grounded. He visited schools and community centers, sharing his story with young people and encouraging them to believe in the power of justice. One evening, after speaking at a local high school, Marcus was approached by a teenage boy named Jamal. Jamal hesitated before speaking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Mr. Johnson," he said softly, "I want to thank you for what you're doing. I've seen cops treat my dad the same way they treated you. It makes me mad, but hearing your story gives me hope." Marcus knelt down to meet Jamal's eye level, offering him a warm smile. "Hope is important, Jamal," he said gently, "but don't just stop at hope. Work hard, stay strong, and never let anyone tell you that you don't deserve respect. You have the power to make a difference just like anyone else." Jamal nodded, his face lighting up with determination. As he walked away, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every interaction like this reminded him why he had chosen this path, to inspire others to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. Meanwhile, public opinion about the trial continued to evolve. News outlets analyzed every aspect of the case, sparking debates across the country. Some praised Marcus for his courage and integrity, calling him a hero. Others criticized the verdict, claiming it undermined the authority of law enforcement. But Marcus didn't pay much attention to the noise. He focused on what mattered most: ensuring that justice was served fairly and equitably. Over time, the ripple effects of the trial became evident. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing their policies on racial profiling, implementing new training programs to address bias. Local governments allocated funds to improve oversight and accountability within police departments. Activists celebrated these changes as small victories, knowing there was still a long road ahead. But progress, no matter how incremental, gave them reason to hope. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. Becoming a judge had opened doors he hadn't imagined, allowing him to influence the system from within. Yet he understood that true change required more than individual victories, it needed collective effort. He continued working tirelessly, collaborating with organizations and individuals committed to dismantling systemic racism. By the end of the year, Marcus's name had become synonymous with resilience and justice. People looked to him as a symbol of hope, proof that even in the face of adversity, fairness could prevail. And though scars remained, from the night of his arrest to the challenges he faced daily, Marcus chose forgiveness over bitterness. He believed that holding on to anger would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. Instead, he focused on building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a better future for generations to come. Little did Marcus know, his impact extended far beyond the courtroom. His story inspired countless others to stand up against injustice, proving that one person's courage could ignite change. And as he reflected on everything he had accomplished, Marcus reminded himself of a simple truth. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about healing, growth, and the unwavering belief that equality was worth fighting for. Months passed since the trial, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for everyone involved. For Greg Peterson and Chris Miller, prison became their reality, a stark contrast to the lives they had once led. Days in the correctional facility were long and monotonous, filled with routines that left little room for personal freedom. Meals were served at strict times, recreation was limited to short periods outdoors, and interactions with other inmates were often tense. Greg found himself reflecting on his past actions more frequently. At first, he tried to justify what he had done, blaming the system or claiming he was just doing his job. But as time went on, those excuses began to feel hollow. During group therapy sessions, inmates shared stories of how encounters with law enforcement had changed their lives, some losing loved ones, others being wrongfully imprisoned. Greg listened quietly, his guilt growing heavier with each story. One day, after hearing a young man recount how his brother had died during an arrest, Greg broke down. He realized he wasn't just guilty of profiling Marcus. He represented everything wrong with a system that dehumanized people based on race. Chris struggled differently. He avoided conversations about the outside world, burying himself in books and puzzles to distract from his thoughts. But late at night, when silence fell over the cell block, memories of the trial haunted him. He replayed Marcus's questions in his mind, the calm yet piercing tone that exposed every lie and inconsistency. Chris couldn't escape the shame of knowing he had judged someone without evidence, mocking them instead of treating them with respect. Slowly, he began writing letters, not just to his family, but also to organizations advocating for police reform. It was small, but it was a start. Outside of prison, Marcus Johnson continued balancing his roles as a judge and an advocate for change. His days were busy, often stretching late into the evening. Court sessions required his full attention, ensuring fairness and impartiality in every decision. Yet, beyond the courtroom, Marcus remained deeply committed to addressing systemic issues. He joined task forces focused on improving community police relations, speaking at conferences and participating in workshops designed to educate officers about bias and accountability. One Saturday morning, Marcus visited a local youth center where teenagers gathered to discuss social justice. The room buzzed with energy as kids shared their experiences with discrimination and inequality. A girl named Mia stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "My uncle got stopped by cops last week," she said. They didn't even tell him why, all because he drives a nice car. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. That shouldn't happen, he replied gently. No one should be treated unfairly because of stereotypes. But remember this, you have power too. Speak up, share your story, and never stop believing that things can get better. The room erupted in applause and Mia smiled shyly, sitting back down. Moments like these reminded Marcus why he kept pushing forward. Each conversation planted seeds of hope, inspiring young minds to dream of a fairer world. At work, Marcus faced challenges unique to his position. Some colleagues questioned whether his advocacy efforts undermined his role as a judge. They worried he might appear biased in future cases. But Marcus dismissed these concerns, explaining that justice required action both inside and outside the courtroom. If I see something wrong, I can't stay silent, he told Linda Harper during one of their meetings. Being a judge doesn't mean turning a blind eye, it means standing up for what's right. Linda admired Marcus's resolve. Over coffee one afternoon, she said, "You're changing the game, Marcus. People are starting to listen because of you." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not just me. Everyone fighting for justice plays a part. I'm just trying to do my share." As months turned into a year, the impact of Marcus's efforts became undeniable. Community programs aimed at reducing racial profiling gained traction, supported by increased funding and public interest. Police departments implemented body cameras and stricter oversight policies, responding to pressure from activists and citizens alike. Even lawmakers began drafting legislation to address systemic racism within institutions. While progress was slow, it was steady, a testament to the collective effort of countless individuals working toward the same goal. For Marcus, the journey brought moments of reflection. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the window in his apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about the night of his arrest, the fear and frustration he had felt. Those emotions still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. Instead, they fueled his determination to create lasting change. One evening, Emily Dawson, the paralegal who had supported Marcus throughout his ordeal, stopped by for dinner. She brought dessert, a homemade apple pie, and they spent hours talking about everything that had happened. Emily admitted she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the scale of the problems they were trying to solve. "It feels like we're chipping away at a mountain," she said, cutting another slice of pie. Marcus smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Every chip matters," he said. "We don't have to move the whole mountain at once. Just keep going, step by step." Emily nodded, her spirits lifted by his optimism. Conversations like these reminded her why she had chosen a career in law, to make a difference, however small. By the end of the year, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. A national organization dedicated to civil rights honored him with an award for his contributions to justice reform. At the ceremony, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and supporters, Marcus accepted the accolade humbly. "This isn't just my victory," he said, holding the trophy aloft. "It belongs to everyone who has ever fought for fairness and equality. Together, we've shown that change is possible, but our work is far from finished." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing through the hall. As Marcus stepped off the stage, strangers approached him, thanking him for his courage and leadership. Among them was Mrs. Harper, the neighbor who had witnessed his arrest and called Linda that fateful night. Her eyes glistened with tears as she hugged him tightly. "You've made us proud," she whispered. In the years that followed, Marcus's influence continued to grow. He wrote articles, gave lectures, and mentored young lawyers eager to follow in his footsteps. His courtroom remained a place of integrity where truth mattered above all else. And though scars from the past remained, both personal and societal, he chose to focus on healing rather than hatred. For Greg and Chris, redemption came slowly. After serving their sentences, they returned to society, forever changed by their experiences. Both men struggled to reintegrate, facing judgment from former colleagues and neighbors. But they also carried lessons learned behind bars, lessons about empathy, accountability, and the importance of treating others with dignity. Though they could never undo the harm they had caused, they vowed to live differently, using their mistakes as reminders of the need for compassion. In the end, Marcus's story wasn't just about justice served, it was about transformation. It showed that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge. It proved that accountability, though painful, paved the way for growth. And it reminded everyone who heard it that true change began with courage. The courage to stand up, speak out, and believe in a better tomorrow. And so Marcus walked forward one step at a time, carrying hope in his heart and justice in his hands.